Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Committee on Standards of Quality, which is a committee of the whole of the board. You know, as many of you were here when we first prescribed the SOQs back in 19, we have undertaken to do sort of an annual review of where we are with the SOQs, with the goal of prescribing them again in the fall. And Dr. Sale, before you speak, apparently we noticed in the meeting notice that we would take public comment. So I'm going to first ask to see, is there anybody from the public who would wish to comment on the topic of the standards of quality? Do not all stampede the podium at once. You know, it's sort of discouraging to have waited 15 months to hear public comment.
And there is none.
Live, and to have absolutely none. But I will accept that as the story of my life here. Okay, then we will move on to the 2021 biennial review of the standards of quality, revisiting the 2019 prescription, and evaluating progress. Dr. Sale, thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you for having me. And can you pick me up, or am I being picked up on the mic from back here? Okay, wonderful. Well, because this is the first occasion for me at least to present in person, although I have had the opportunity and pleasure to present in front of the board and its other committees in the virtual setting, I certainly hope that I can live up to my virtual predecessor here. But I will reintroduce myself in the flesh. So I am Dr. Leslie Sale. I am the Director of Policy with the Department of Education. And so pleased to be before you today in person and to provide you an overview of the standards of quality and kind of reflect on where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going, so that hopefully will facilitate our discussion here moving forward. So we'll get started. Let's see if, there we go. Per usual, I like to start the presentations just kind of taking stock and inventory of what we're going to accomplish today together as a group. And so first and foremost, we'll start the discussion by revisiting the mandate that brings us here and reflecting on the duty and authority of the board as it relates to the standards of quality. So as President Gecker mentioned, the last time that this particular group was formally convened actually started in the fall of 2018, but then eventually adopted their 2019 prescriptions in the fall of 2019. And so we will kind of start with creating that starting line there and that benchmark and discuss the work products and what came of that discussion there in 2019. And then from there, obviously, we know that this biennium in particular has been jam-packed with new things and an evolving state of education, and plenty has happened between the last time or since the last time this group has come together and as we stand here today. So a primary goal of the presentation here will be to just kind of reflect and again take stock of all of the things that have happened since 2019, how that's had an impact on the standards of quality, and of course how that's intersected with the work and the prescriptions that you all put forth in 2019 and reaffirmed in 2020. Some of the actions that we will talk about over the course of the last 2 years are initiated by General Assembly action. So there have been a number of pieces of legislation that have impacted the standards of quality, but plenty has happened in the biennium outside of the General Assembly sessions as well. We know there have been multiple JLARC studies that have implicated the agency, as well as a number of commissions and committees that have come together to discuss topics of critical relevance to the standards of quality. And so we'll take a look at both the legislative perspective as well as those other inputs that might be worthwhile for us to consider in this discussion. So, and of course, taking 2019 as our benchmark and our starting line, we will figure out how we build on the foundation and the work that we've done over the last 2 years to chart our course forward and use that new information to think about how we might put forth some prescriptions for the 2020 biennial review, or 2021 biennial review, or even future iterations of reviews. So we can think about this in 2, 4, 6, 8-year increments here and really think forward. So just to start us off with a quick review of the standards of quality, I know many are veterans to this process and know the standards of quality well, but it's always helpful to just kind of get our footing on what we're working with and how we got the authority to do so. So really the reason that we're here today is the Constitution of Virginia. So Article 8, Section 2 of the Constitution tasks the Board of Education with prescribing or from time to time reviewing and prescribing the standards of quality for public education in Virginia. And this is, of course, also codified in the Code of Virginia, and that actually happened back in the 1980s. And so oftentimes when we reference the standards of quality, you'll hear them referenced in context of the Code of Virginia. But what that really means, and broadly speaking, what the standards of quality are really the foundational component of our public education system here in Virginia. And it's really our expectation and our kind of common baseline for how we provide and maintain a quality educational program in Virginia. And you can see in that third bullet there, as it talks about how this is codified in Virginia, it really touches on a range of programmatic and topical issues. So it's everywhere from instructional programs, which we often talk about with the standards of learning, to our staffing ratios, to how we're evaluating teachers, and even our local school board policies. So thinking about all of those pieces of the puzzle that we need in place to implement a quality program of education in Virginia. And I think we often also think about these as inputs. So in our next conversation with the standards of accreditation, we'll reflect on how we measure outcomes and how we hold school divisions accountable for student achievement and growth and continuous improvement. But the standards of quality are kind of not necessarily the inverse of that, but almost a prerequisite in that these are the things that we know have to go into the system to facilitate those positive outcomes. So something important here that's not noted on the slide, that the standards of quality are not only critical to us from a programmatic standpoint, but they're also really important for driving funding. So as we put the standards of quality, it also sets the expectation for the state about our obligation of what we need to contribute to make sure that schools are able and equipped to provide those staffing ratios and instructional programs that we have deemed as a necessary component of a quality educational program in Virginia. So the Constitution, as I noted, asks the board to review and look at the standards of quality from time to time. And it's the Code of Virginia that has us coming together here again on a 2-year basis. So that's where we get that timetable for the biannual review. And again, while we're formally convened here in 2021, but of course, as President Gecker said, there's always opportunity for the board to reflect on this on a regular annual basis. Ooh. So in 2019, our last benchmark here, per its constitutional responsibility, the board came together to prescribe the standards of quality in 2019. And that was based on almost over a year's worth of work. So there was a lot in terms of public comments, going out into the field, talking with practitioners, advocacy organizations, really folks from across the board to put together those prescriptions that came together again in 2019. And aside from the board meeting its constitutional authority, it wasn't a routine year in 2019. This was an exceptional year in many cases. One of them being just the scale of the work and the types of prescriptions that were put forward in 2019. And I think the reason for that coincides with a few different things that were happening with the board. So you all had just put forward your comprehensive plan in 2018, which established 3 core priorities for you all as a board. So it was an opportunity to kind of reflect what you wanted to see done into some action and some policy recommendations. And you had also recently convened the Special Committee for Evidence-Based Policymaking. And so these came together I guess you could say it as an opportunity for us to look at the standards of quality a little bit more comprehensively and holistically than had been done in years prior. So it was, again, the scale of the work that happened in 2019 was very robust. And a big change that also happened in 2019 was how we talk about the standards of quality in terms of the board's role and responsibility. So something you all did is went beyond evaluating the substance of the standards, but the board's responsibility in putting forward those. And so you'll see a shift in documents around the standards of quality in 2019. Starting to think about them not as recommendations to the General Assembly, but as the board fulfilling its prescribe the standards of quality, which again is its constitutional duty and authority to do so. So it was really kind of asserting the board's role as experts in the field and folks who are well positioned and well poised to comment on what the quality of a public education system in Virginia really looks like. So since then, we've had 2 years where the General Assembly has received the standards of quality from the board, had a chance to reflect and implement some of them. We'll talk more about what has happened from the General Assembly perspective in the coming slides. But a bit of a spoiler alert, we haven't fully realized our 2019 prescriptions yet, so there's still certainly more work to be done. But I think you'll be pleased with some of the progress that we have made in the standards of quality space. So prescriptions from the 2019 biennial review of the standards of quality. I know you all probably can recite all of these in your sleep, but we will quickly revisit all of them. So we're all familiar again where we're starting from with 2019 as our benchmark here. Sorry, and I'm navigating 2 sets of slides here, so let me know if I get off kilter on either one. The first one here is the equity fund. And of course, all of the prescriptions that you all put forth in the standards of quality space are significant and substantive. But this is certainly one of the bigger ones in thinking about how we direct specifically financial support to those students and school divisions most in need of it. And so in doing so, it was really thinking about the current funding models for things like the at-risk add-on program, which is in the budget, the prevention, remediation, intervention programs, which is also set out in the budget, and looking at how those calculated, who's getting what money and at what scale and degree, and really kind of correcting for almost a lack of variation in what some school divisions are seeing, regardless of their population of free and reduced lunch status, and some of the other things that we know indicate an increased need for additional financial support to really be able to support the students that are in their community. So the equity fund actually consolidated the at-risk add-on and the prevention, remediation, and intervention fund to allow for, again, that funding to be directed to the right places and making sure those school divisions that need it the most and need the supports for serving their students both academically and outside the classroom are getting those funds there. And also provided a little bit of flexibility in how those funds can be used. So making sure that all of those services and all of those things like prevention and remediation are still being provided, but also recognizing that teachers in the classroom and the quality of your instructors and how you're matching your teachers with your students are also important variables there. So looking at that a little bit more holistically. The second recommendation was the K-3 class size reduction. And this is an opportunity to make sure our early learners are in small classes and with quality instructors. So we know that they're getting the attention and intervention when appropriate at a very early stage. So we're setting them up for success. And it's done by kind of scaling class sizes and ratios of teacher to student based on populations of free and reduced lunch students in the classroom. And this is currently an incentive program that is based in the Appropriation Act, but by moving it to the SOQ, as this prescription would do, it's really cementing the importance of that. So we know the Appropriation Act is revisited every year with the General Assembly, but really substantively looked at on a biennial cycle. By including it in the SOQ, again, we're kind of saying that this is of critical importance on an ongoing basis and really want to see it cemented in that way. Our teacher leader and teacher mentor program. So this would be combining, this particular prescription is combining both a new recommendation, which is the teacher leader program, and expanding our current teacher mentor program to make sure that we're supporting teachers and keeping them in the profession. So we know that teacher induction and creating an environment of support and really allowing teachers to grow professionally as an important part of retention. So building the infrastructure that allows folks to do that was one of the many prescriptions that you all put forth there. Just as a kind of framework for what you had recommended, that would actually be creating a staffing structure for the teacher leader and mentor program to make sure folks were on hand in each of our schools and divisions to provide these resources and supports to incoming teachers or new teachers. And that would have been 1 staff member to 15 first and second year teachers, as well as 1 staff member to 50 teachers with 3 or more years of experience. So it was kind of scaled depending on the length of time that that your teachers have been in the classroom, and again, making sure that those younger teachers are getting the supports that they need. Our English learner teachers was a kind of a two-pronged prescription. It was really one of the big parts was updating the EL teacher ratio to reflect the changing demographic in the Commonwealth. But it also differentiated the staffing depending on the proficiency level of your students. So it recognized certain school divisions and certain schools may have varied need in the types and amount of staffing that they have on hand for English learners. And so making sure that the right schools have the appropriate amount of staffing to provide that support. Reading specialists. So we know in the standards of quality already, reading intervention services are a mandated kind of service provision of school divisions, but reading specialists as a staff member are not. So it was making sure that we have the right staff in schools to provide these services. And the current language certainly recognizes, the many different roles that folks that can provide these types of services to students and does create a flexible environment, but recognizes that reading specialists play a critical and important role in those intervention services. And so making sure, again, that they are on hand to provide those services based on the need demonstrated by assessment rates at the local school division level. Specialized student support positions. So this established a 4 to 1,000 student ratio for certain support positions, which, as we know, the SOQ being a driver of funding, meant that these also were funded as part of the SOQ formula. And the reason for doing this, so of course right now, we do set out requirements for support positions, not at a specific ratio, but that category encompasses everything from administrative positions to maintenance workers to those individuals providing direct services to students. So wanted to make sure that, in that bucket and larger bucket and larger category, that we were making sure that those direct service provisions were appropriately funded and appropriately resourced. Because of course we know that there is an increasing need for folks like school psychologists, school nurses, school social workers who are doing the support and a lot of the direct service work that makes such a huge difference for our students outside of the classroom. School counselors. This is one that we have seen in a few different iterations of the board's SOQ prescriptions. This is one that was actually originally prescribed in 2016 to align with the American School Counselors Association, who recommended a 1 to 250 student ratio for school counselors. And one of the big components of this is that school counselors play such an important role in helping us implement the profile of the Virginia graduate. So as we're thinking about what career track or what college-bound track, what courses, what work-based learning experiences might be meaningful and valuable to a student as they move through the public education system, school counselors are important and critical in that work. So making sure students have access to that resource. Elementary school principals, again, another 2016 recommendation. Right now, there's a provision in the standards of quality that if your school is smaller than 299 students, you can have a part-time principal. But we know principals are more than just academic and instructional leaders. They play roles in just managing the day-to-day, keep those trains running on time, campus safety, a whole host of things. And so it's really important to have that person with boots on the ground and able to respond and react quickly to what's happening on their campus. So of utmost importance that every school has a principal on hand. Assistant principals, again, another 2016 recommendation, and I should actually put an asterisk on that. So not only was this recommended in 2016, this has actually been a board recommendation since 2003. So this is something that you all have recognized as a priority for some time, that as the expanding role of building administrators grows in both scale of responsibility and complexity of responsibility, more is being put on our principals, hence a need for making sure folks are available in each school building. But that also ends up with delegation to our assistant principals who are playing important supporting roles for our principals and providing that building level support and infrastructure there. So this would be set at a 1 to 400 ratio, and currently in the standards of quality, there is kind of a step-up scale for how assistant principals are staffed. So again, this is creating some consistency and reliability in assistant principals as a resource to the building. Similar to our teacher, leader, and mentorship programs, we also prescribed a principal mentorship program. And this is really, again, based on the concept that keeping qualified and talented folks and growing those qualified and talented folks in their roles is of utmost importance. And principals play a huge role in school climate, teacher quality. All of that has a trickle-down effect in the building level. So making sure that those principals are well-equipped, continuing to hone and refine their skills as building level administrators, and providing the sources to do so. Because it is not quite as easy to pair a teacher or a principal with a principal as it is a teacher with a teacher, this particular prescription was actually a state-based position. So having someone at the agency providing some coordination and networking for principals to make sure the right folks were connecting with the right folks to provide those professional development supports. And lastly, another state-based position was the work-based learning coordinator. So again, another core priority of a lot of the work that the board's done is thinking about college and career readiness. And then of course, making sure students are exposed at earlier and early ages with all sorts of opportunities to hone skill sets, try on new things, really find what skill sets they want to take on and their interests. And so that can be difficult to do, just knowing the logistical challenges of building relationships with businesses across communities, all of those moving parts that factor in to create successful work-based learning environments and experiences for students. And then of course, we know there's some difficulty in rural areas making those connections when it's harder to come by businesses who can take on interns or provide those work-based learning experiences. So having a state-based position would allow a statewide and Commonwealth-wide coordination of all of those efforts to make sure every student can be paired with those types of experiences and opportunities. I will note before we move into how we've seen some changes in the 2020 and 2021 legislative session, the board actually, in addition to these 11 prescriptions, recommended 3 other items, which I'll just quickly note. The first 2 are related to recession era provisions in the Appropriation Act. The first being staffing flexibility. So it effectively, the SOQ that set staffing ratios, it was providing kind of a small adjustment in how school divisions could implement those staffing ratios to provide, a small amount of flexibility, recognizing the fiscal stress that the recession in 2009 and 2010 put on our schools and divisions. Of course, as we move out of the recession, one of the goals being to see the restoration of funding as available and making sure that we are extending money to school divisions to meet those SOQ ratios, knowing that we've determined them to be, again, a critical part of a quality public education system in Virginia. And the second piece is how support positions are calculated and funded. So again, as a recession era measure, there were, attempts by the General Assembly, and I shouldn't say attempts, there was a desire from the General Assembly to be able to provide some, additional flexibility to school divisions and how they meet support positions. And then of course, remove some of the financial burden, knowing that we were in a recession era. And so by removing that, it would, again, provide more money to divisions to support that larger category of support positions. And then the last item was improving data collection generally. So as you notice, a lot of your recommendations touch on staffing and the importance of staffing and making sure you all are well equipped with the data that you need to make educated decisions in that space. So again, I know we talked about that the 2019 SOQ prescriptions, which were again reaffirmed in 2020, have not been fully realized, but we have seen a lot of progress and a lot of movement in the General Assembly space as it relates to the SOQ. So we'll highlight just a few of those. The first is House Bill 975 and Senate Bill 910, which were part of the 2020 session, and actually you'll see all of them here from the 2020 session, which started a phased-in approach to upgrading or updating the English learner-teacher ratios. So something of note here that even though we do see an increase in the number of English learner teachers, which will increase this coming school year or increase last year to 18.5, and then the coming school year to 20 full-time positions to 1,000 students. This did not include your recommendation for differentiation in the types of instruction, or rather the staffing ratio per proficiency level of the students. House Bill 1508 and Senate Bill 880 also took a phased-in approach to getting us a little bit closer to the school counselor ratio. And where we ultimately landed was a 1 to 325 student ratio, which will be in full or go into the phase of full implementation for the 2021-2022 school year. You all may have heard some discussion last year when the Appropriation Act or the General Assembly revisited the budget based on concerns around COVID projections, that our interim step was delayed to account for some shortfalls in cash. But of course that since we've come full circle here and recognize that the resources are available, that the 1 to 325 will be fully funded for the 2021-2022 school year. And lastly, while this isn't an SOQ prescription, I thought it would be of value to note for you all that House Bill 1388, which was actually an agency bill, eliminated the option of triennial accreditation, which is in the SOQ. And really what that was meant to do is that as you all evaluated your accountability system and the standards of accreditation, to look more holistically about what student outcomes and student achievement, closing achievement gaps, and really not hedging everything on passing rates. That this reflected that change, that if school divisions or schools were going to be rewarded in the space of accreditation by being allowed a triennial accreditation review cycle, that should be based on a complete picture and not just the pass rates for schools. Oh, and before actually, I will go back, even though this isn't on the slide here. What I have up here are bills that passed the General Assembly, but something that, again, is of importance for you all is that there were 2 bills that incorporated the entire SOQ prescription, so all 11 prescriptions that you all had put forward in both the 2020 and 2021 session, and we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of the 2021 bill here in a moment. And both of those bills passed the policy committees, so there was support from a policy and programmatic side for those, but ultimately they didn't make it out of House appropriations with the funding limitation being really kind of the hiccup there. But I think important for us to reflect on that they did see movement from a policy and programmatic perspective. Senate Bill 1257, this was actually a bill that started as the entire SOQ from Senator McClellan. And I think the reason that we see so few bills on this particular slide for the 2021 session was in part because of the limits on the number of bills. So legislators were being very strategic in how they were using the number of introduced bills allotted to them. But again, this one did start as a full SOQ bill. But after negotiation and really kind of honing in on priorities, especially in the time of COVID during 2021, this was pared back to really focus on those specialized student support positions. And what this bill ultimately produced was a new ratio of specialized student support positions. And I guess I should start with a new category of staffing positions to make sure that they were fully funded in the budget. And there was an established ratio for these important positions, which included school psychologists, social workers, school nurses, and other health and licensed behavior personnel. So as of this coming year, there is the requirement to staff that at 3 to 1,000. And lastly, there was budget language that removed that staffing flexibility. So we talked about the board having some prescriptions and then some recommendations on things that would support SOQ work. The budget did remove that recession era flexibility for staffing in the second year. So as we approach the 21-22 school year, the ratios that are set out in the standards of quality and standard 2 specifically are in full effect. There are no more flexibilities or provisions to provide a little bit of additional space for school divisions there. Other related legislation. So this is, again, not directly related or explicitly related to the prescriptions you all put forward in 2019, but I think will be of importance and value for us as we continue the discussion this year and in years beyond. Senate Bill 933, which was passed in 2020. You all are already familiar with this, and I think I've heard a few presentations on some of the work to come from this bill now around students with limited or interrupted formal education. And this bill really kind of prompts the department and board to better understand the student population, both in terms of size of demographic, as well as the existing supports that we're providing those students. So this work is currently underway. We have established a statewide definition for what a SLIFE student means. means. With that, we can better evaluate who these students are and where they're kind of concentrated across the Commonwealth. And then, of course, the next step from there is understanding how those divisions are providing for support to those students. House Bill 1653 also helps get at this discussion around the availability of data, especially as it relates to staffing, and it requires the department to collect data on the ability to fill school counselor positions. And so this was kind of hand in hand with the increase in ratio for our school counselors to making sure our supply was meeting our demand here. And this work is actually due fairly soon, so we will have a report on what that data looks like here forthcoming in the next few weeks, which we'll be able to share with you all to reflect on in this work. House Bill 3557 expands our collection of vacancy data to not just instructional personnel, but all licensed personnel and support positions. So again, getting a fuller picture of where our staffing exists, and particularly where the holes in staffing exist. And then House Bill 2299 and Senate Bill 1288. These were bills that were largely drawn from the JLARC study on special education in Virginia, which included a number of provisions related to special education. But as we think about the standards of quality, tasked the department with looking at the requirements for the applied studies diploma, which is part of the, is related to the standards of quality as we set out the graduation requirement. So the future of the SOQ, we've talked about, oh, yes.
So I have a couple of questions about the legislation that's already passed.
Yes.
Would you like them now, or do you want to after the future discussion?
I don't have a preference. However, would facilitate the discussion best for you all. So I might defer to President Gecker here if you would like to kind of pause to reflect and take some questions, or see the rest of the presentation through and
I don't have a strong preference, but just clarifying questions, so whenever you want.
I think it's okay. We're going to finish the presentation and then
Absolutely.
we'll do it.
all right. Okay, so again, we've reflected on where we started, what's happened, or where we've been now, and now where we're going. As I mentioned, there was much more to happen in the last 2 years than just the General Assembly sessions and the legislation that passed in those spaces. But we also had those 3 JLARC studies come through that all implicated the Virginia Department of Education and might provide us some opportunity to think about changes to the standards of quality. I think of a particular note for us in this space is the JLARC study that was specific to the agency operations. And there were actually some recommendations specific to the standards of quality, specifically how we measure and evaluate compliance. And so resulting from that is budget language that has us doing an SOQ data compliance pilot and looking a little bit more closely at how schools are meeting compliance with the SOQ standards, as well as verifying compliance. So really asking for some additional evidence to show supporting information, and again, supporting evidence is really the best word for it, that every school division and school are meeting their responsibility as it relates to the standards. And the second piece, which is a little tangential, but I think kind of fits into our larger picture around how we provide support to schools, is around our Office of School Quality and putting together a plan for how we grow our Office of School Quality and our school improvement model. And I think an important part of that is, of course, outcomes, but also inputs and making sure that the school divisions that we see having trouble or see needing support are also able to meet these standards. And so I think that'll help us kind of look introspectively at what we're asking of school divisions to meet as that baseline expectation of quality, and where some of these divisions could provide or could accept support to get there. We have some recommendations from the African American Superintendent's Advisory Council, which may be meaningful for us in our discussion. The 2 that are specifically related to the standards of quality and are actually delineated in the memo as such are the equitable distribution of experienced teachers among high and low poverty schools, which I should note is a component of the equity fund. And then require a culturally responsive and inclusive practices coordinator in every division. So that would be, helping us think through some other opportunities for staffing requirements at the local school division level. And then, of course, there's opportunities for us to revisit outstanding or ongoing discussions that we know have been of importance or interest to the board These are not necessarily indicative of everything that we've talked about over the last few years, but some of the ones that were top of mind for us as we were reflecting on the SOQ being standards for facilities, teacher coaching programs, special education staff ratios, mathematics specialists, and instructional technology of resource teachers, especially knowing the evolving role of technology and virtual instruction. And lastly, just to kind of revisit where we are on data collection, kind of in response to one of the board's prescriptions, or rather recommendations around additional data collection and additional data, especially as it relates to staffing. There has been some work in this space, as we've seen, some in part response to General Assembly legislation, some in parts responding to JLARC recommendations, and some at agency initiative here. But we will have additional information around compliance from the SOQ pilot program, which we'll be able to share in forthcoming years. And expanded data collection on vacancies, which again will incorporate all licensed personnel and support positions. Teacher race and ethnicity data, which is actually now recently available, publicly available on the website. And exit survey data collected from local school divisions. And this is actually an extension of a pilot program that the department was tasked with putting together several years ago to better understand why teachers are leaving either the profession or their buildings or fields or particular positions, and better understanding the trends about that across the Commonwealth. So I believe that's actually hopefully not. Yep, there we go. At the end of the presentation there, which I think means I can maybe hand the mic over to Ms. Holton to start their questions if that's the will of President Gecker here.
You're welcome to hand the mic to whomever you want.
I'm not rushing.
No. Ms. Holton?
So I just had a couple of clarifying questions.
Sure.
One was on the, thank you, by the way, that was extremely helpful to remind us what we've done before. So on the school counselor one, we had recommended 250, 1 to 250.
Yes.
What the General Assembly did was 1 to 325.
Yes, and that will be implemented this school year, 21-22.
And if I'm correct, what my recollection is previously where we were was 1 to 450, but was that in the standard, or was that just what their estimate? There was nothing in the standard before, and we were just estimating that we were at 1 to 450?
There was ratios in the standards of quality, but they were scaled based on the size of student population and grade. And I can pull that back up, and Holly, I don't know if you know offhand.
And I will say the 1 to 450 was more what practice was than what was in the standards. But as Dr. Stowe mentioned, it was more scaled based on the size of the school. And at one point, they also put in ratios based on grade level. So elementary was one level, middle was one level, and high school was another.
So to help me understand broad brush, the 1 to 325 is significant progress towards our recommended 250, but it's not there yet. And the phased-in bill doesn't take it beyond the 325.
Right. So the phased-in part of it would actually have been a stopgap between what it was before to the 1 to 325, but we never ended up implementing that. It remained at the 2019-2020 levels because of the Appropriation Act changes.
So if we choose to reaffirm that recommendation, this biennium, for this set of biennial recommendations, then the 250 is still not yet met.
Yes, there's still more movement to be had there.
So that's one. And then the other one I wanted to understand is on the specialized support positions. We had recommended 4 to 1,000, and the General Assembly adopted 3 to 1,000.
Yes.
So similarly, there's still potentially a gap that we may or may not want to include a recommendation to continue to get to where we had prescribed before. And the other piece of that one I wanted to understand is we had also recommended that those specialized positions be taken out from under the student support cap. In the General Assembly, did they do that?
Yes, it was pulled. So it is its own staffing category now, which means it's pulled out from what would be considered the support position cap. So those are funded separately through the SOQ formula, as you all had prescribed for the 4 to 1,000. The only discrepancy there is that additional last staff person, since that's only 3 to 1,000.
So if I understand that correctly, that not only gives divisions more expectations and resources to meet with respect to the specialized positions, but it also frees up a little bit of money that was coming in under the student support cap for other support positions.
Yes, I believe so. And some of the mechanics of how the support position cap and the funding side, I don't want to mischaracterize. But I believe that would be the case, that additional funding would be opened up in that space since those positions are being funded through a separate formula and model.
Unless the cap was also somehow adjusted, which we don't think it was.
Yes, that would be my understanding, but certainly something we could confirm and circle back with since again,
The only thing I would add to that is I think it's fair to say that school divisions are spending far beyond the sport cap, so I don't think it has a practical impact.
At least in most divisions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, prevailing practice has been that school divisions are going well above and beyond the support cap, since that's a little bit of an arbitrary number to some extent. So as Dr. Ling mentioned, I don't think it really frees up, any actual funding since they were already supporting most of the positions well above.
But they do get the specialized support money, so that is the impact. But I would not think of it as a huge benefit to the sport cap, other than reducing the burden should it want to get back to not having that cap.
Thank you for the clarification. That was all I had on those.
Just say a few words if it's okay. Is that it now?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I would just like you, if you don't mind, I looked back and saw that really only 3 of us here, were on the board that passed the comprehensive work plan. And so if it's okay with the board, let me do just a few minutes of where I think we were and how we got to where we are today. Just, it's hard as the board changes membership to keep sort of that common theme going. And from 17 to, 21 is a long enough period that we've had substantial change in personnel. One of my goals, and I think that this has been, I hope, obvious, has been that the board not only stay within its lane, that is our constitutional and statutory lane as the educational policy body, but also do those things that we are supposed to do. A couple of them make sense to us. I hope this one does. A couple of them sometimes, we have some pushback on, like, why are we now approving superintendents? Why are we certifying superintendents? And the answer to that is because the Constitution says we're supposed to certify the superintendents. In modern practice, is it necessary? Maybe not, but it certainly does put us back to where we're supposed to be. In 17, we passed a comprehensive work plan that was supposed to run and will run, from 18 to 23. And the sort of 3 stated goals and loosely stated goals of that plan were, number 1, to figure out how to do equity in the Commonwealth. And frankly, unfortunately, the equity word has been bandied about so much now, and in so many contexts, it may have lost some meaning. But in the context of the time, the board was very concerned about every child not having necessarily equal outcome, but equal resources and those resources necessary to achieve an equal outcome, so that every group would be on par with every other group. Loosely stated, and I think the department adopted this, when we can no longer predict outcomes by zip code, we'll know we've achieved equity in the distribution of resources in the Commonwealth. And, our goal, just to be clear, is not to bring the top down, but to raise everybody up. So that was sort of number 1. Number 2 was we recognized, and there was a lot of press back in the 17-18 timeframe about the need for teachers. We still have a teacher shortfall that may be actually exacerbated by the pandemic. But certainly in those days, we were, give or take, rough number, 1,000 teachers short a year in the Commonwealth. We understood that teachers were leaving the profession if they left at an early, fairly early in their careers. And we understood also that, teachers matter to the educational outcomes of our kids. And, frankly, when you cut through everything that we do, our goal is to improve educational outcomes for our children. That is really the sum, in my view, of what this board's responsibility is. In addition, we recognize that building leadership matters. It matters because principals relate to their teachers. And frankly, every study that looks at this indicates that if you take the top two things that are going to matter to educational outcome, number one is going to be teachers, and number two is going to be building leadership. And how the building leadership interacts exactly, they're not sure, but it's clear that it matters substantially. And number three, of course, is the accreditation piece, which the board has really not attacked yet in any significant way. We spent a fair amount of time, as Dr. Sale mentioned, researching. And I will tell you that when it started, there was a belief, certainly I believe, that what we would come back with were recommendations around social safety nets, more counselors, more social workers, putting more resources in the schools. And what we ended up with was a very much teacher-focused outcome. The recognition, I like to say, that the message of the SOQs is simply that teachers matter. And we built in, and we also understand that every teacher is not as effective as every other teacher. And if you look at the data, kids in poorer schools or kids of lower socioeconomic backgrounds were being taught more frequently by more inexperienced teachers or teachers teaching outside their endorsed areas. And if you go to what was referred to as sort of the principal recommendation or the principal prescription in our SOQs, yes, it deals with allocating money, but really what it is allocating policy. And that policy is that not that we can force a, quote, equitable distribution of teachers, but we may be able to incentivize teachers of higher teaching effectiveness to lower socioeconomic jurisdictions by paying them more. And it was anticipated that the additional money in that standard, as we merged into the equity fund, would be used to more evenly distribute teaching talent throughout the Commonwealth. Or alternatively, if you look at the same standard, those jurisdictions could reduce class size, continue to use younger or less experienced teachers, and thereby hopefully achieve the same results. And that theme of building up our teachers carries through. We have the mentorship program, we have the teacher leadership program. We want to have mentors for principals to have them be able to run their buildings better. And that has been really the primary thrust of the SOQs as we move forward. Now, a little constitutional history, and then I'll be quiet and we can, I know Ann sort of chuckles when I do this, but it's okay. I've gotten used to it over the last 4 years. In 71, Virginia said, Board of Ed, you get to prescribe SOQs from time to time, subject to revision only by the General Assembly. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. The Board of Education prescribed standards of quality. Those standards, interestingly enough, were not codified by the General Assembly, but they were continued on in the uncodified laws of the Commonwealth, indicating that they clearly were temporary. And the General Assembly, frankly, did its work in those days and actually modified the standards of quality. And there was a process in the Assembly to carry that out. In the 80s, the standards became codified. And part of that codification, because frankly, the board wasn't doing its job after a while. We were not, as a board, putting forth the recommendations, the prescriptions, and the Assembly effectively stepped into the vacuum and took it over and relegated us by statute to the biennial review and recommendation process. Despite that, we still have the constitutional, not only, I think, right, but also obligation to continue to prescribe SOQs, and those SOQs are then subject to revision only by the General Assembly. If you go back and read sort of the treatise on the Virginia Constitution done by Dick Howard, what he says basically is we are in charge of educational standards and the Assembly is in charge of the budget. And it would be wrong to say to our body, you can do whatever you want, because that would effectively be a blank check. But the first shot, if you will, at the standards ought to come from us, and then molded around the budget by the General Assembly. And so, I consider, the board to be fairly bold in 19 when we said, okay, for the first time in basically 2 decades, we're going to go ahead and prescribe standards of quality. We did it again last year. not on a biannual cycle, but we did it again pursuant to our constitutional, as I think, obligation. And I'm hopeful that we will do it again this year. This meeting is really the first of maybe one or two, maybe more if we need it, to decide whether we're going to make changes to what we prescribed back in 19 and again back in 20. And as we move towards September, October, we will go ahead and take a vote on whether, what we're going to prescribe for the coming year. The good news in my view, and, we talked about this too at some length, is none of us really believe that they would be adopted, what we do would be adopted whole hog by the General Assembly. I mean, frankly, the amount of time that gets spent focusing on sort of fundamental shifts is pretty minimal when it comes right down to it, and so much turns on the money, and the money here is significant. At the same time, we have clearly laid out a marker, and as we're seeing by, the report today, and frankly, if we're not, living in caves, we see what's going on in the, political environment. People are beginning to adopt our plans as their plans for the future of the Commonwealth. And so, it's still my belief that if in 10 years we've gotten to where we think we ought to be, we'll have done pretty well for ourselves and for the kids in the Commonwealth. But that is, I think, where we are, how we got here, and what our purpose is, not just today, but if we, we'll have at least one more committee meeting before we take this to the full board. But that's to me what we're doing. Now, I will accept any corrections or comments on that. And with regard to staying in our lane, there's a couple of things that are, presented today. For example, I'm not picking on this one specifically, other than as an example. The divisions, the suggestion that we can change division lines. Well, technically true in the Constitution, but the Constitution also says it's subject to the criteria set out by the General Assembly. Those criteria today include requiring the consent of the different jurisdictions. So in fact, although it looks like we have that power, as a practical matter, we don't. And so although we can talk about it as if we can do it, the truth is we can't, outside our purview. And, I continue to hope that we focus on those things that we can really do, that are clearly within our purview, the agenda and the policy that we can move forward. And again, fundamental question always, are the kids better off when we're done? So that's it. Now, any questions for Dr. Sale? Thanks for indulging me. Yes, ma'am.
Well, President Gecker, I always appreciate hearing the history, being reminded of history, and also thinking about, the role of the board. So I appreciate your commentary, and the comprehensive plan is something actually that I continue to go back to in terms of what we do to help people understand. Dr. Sale, thanks very much for the presentation. I do have a couple of, maybe it's observation.
Okay.
Maybe a question. So the action of the General Assembly in both 20 and 21, and to Ms. Holton's question about getting us closer to our goal, we are making progress. Thinking though about that progress in relation to teacher shortage, I think it's fair for us to at some point understand how changes in the teacher ranks and support position ranks, availability of the supply and demand question, right? So we're making progress, but what does the pipeline look like for teachers who work with L students, right? We're increasing the number by standard, but what about the supply? Same thing in those support positions, social workers, school psychologists, behavior analysts. It's one thing we know that the standard has to be there to begin with, but then what are the supports that we have in place as a department in localities, frankly, to help ensure that we are able to fill the positions to be able to affect students and provide them the supports that they need so that then they can have the outcomes that we, So it's like this big circle or a cyclical kind of conversation. So I would at some point be interested to know how those things are moving forward. And it may not be a conversation for today, but I just noted.
Yeah, I'll respond,
Sure.
Leslie, if you don't mind. I think next month we can bring a presentation to you on the supply and demand report, which gives you the information that we do collect. I will tell you, just before a retirement that we're going to celebrate tomorrow, we initiated some new data collection requirements as it relates to teacher supply and demand and background of teachers. And so we'll have even more data next year. So I think I would consider what we share with you next month to be somewhat interim, because I think you'll be really excited to see the level of depth that we're going to be going to in the future.
Dr. Wilson, I would just add to that, when we think about this broader supply and demand picture, when we think about kind of in some of the areas where progress has been made and ratios have been changed, we are in fact funding positions that had existed because divisions had recognized the need before the state caught up to them, essentially. And then we throw the pandemic in the midst and how those factors into play will be interesting to see as we have additional data collection and kind of some of those competing factors, where at the onset we, in our analysis have been, there were plenty of school counselors, for example, in the pipeline. That they were in fact in positions, the state was meeting its obligation to pay for them. But we'll certainly anticipate some changes, unfortunately, due to the pandemic as well.
So may I ask a follow-up?
Of course.
So then, Holly, are you saying that, so we do, does the department collect what that pipeline looks like from our teacher ed programs? Is there a partnership with SHEV or others that allows us to do that?
Yes.
I hear a but.
Yes, but as always. So I'll say on the school counselor piece, for example, as the General Assembly was having that conversation, we looked specifically at how many licensed personnel were out there, how many were coming through those degree programs, and in a very kind of high level way, estimating whether or not the demand was in fact there. The supply was there to meet the demand.
And I would say we have better data on graduate trend than in-process students.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Go with that demand.
Yeah, related to the data question, thank you so much, Dr. Staub, for your presentation. And I'm curious because I heard reference to a data pilot around just how we're tracking and measuring sort of progress with the SOQ. And it made me wonder, prior to this point in history, does that mean that there's been very little data, or maybe there's like a lot of data that could be used, but whether it's conceptually really tied to understanding how the SOQs or the implementation of SOQs are happening? I'm just kind of curious to appreciate, without getting into the weeds of what's in the data pilot, just to kind of understand that, because it seems that this is such a fundamental piece of what drives quality in education. And we're working on a pilot that's going to help us better sort of track our progress. I'm just understanding historically and of how we make sense of that.
Sure, I can start, and if folks want to fill in the holes. So for just a little bit of context about how we collect data around the standards of quality now. So as you know, there are a lot of standards that are incorporated into the standards of quality. And so how we've approached it thus far has been kind of a dichotomous understanding of compliant versus non-compliant as you itemize the different standards. So you don't reflect on compliance versus non-compliance for the whole picture, but divisions are asked to look at each of the individual pieces and indicate to us whether they're compliant or non-compliant. And if they're non-compliant, they have an opportunity to give us information on their corrective action plan. Some of the limitations in our ability to have been able to dig into that work have been an issue of capacity because there's so much there. And then as you think about implementation across school divisions, it's going to look a little bit different in how folks are reaching compliance in some of these standards. And so evidence for verification might look a little bit differently. So again, I think capacity has been a core challenge of us being able to dig in a little bit more. But with the SOQ pilot, this has been an opportunity for us to get a better understanding of what compliance means to divisions. So asking them some additional questions on standards that we know to be a priority and of central importance to us. And as we were thinking about the pilot, the board's comprehensive plan and what you all have indicated as priorities were central to us in thinking about which ones do we really kind of want to drill in on. But we will also have an opportunity to collect those evidence pieces from the division. For example, one of the things that I know we'll be asking of divisions is not just to indicate us whether you have a comprehensive plan that does A, B, C, D, and E, but to provide us your comprehensive plan and us to do a little bit of rubric work almost to make sure that they're going into depth and providing the detail that we really expect to see in something like a comprehensive plan. And that's just exemplary of some of the things that we're thinking about. So we'll have a little bit, a more complete picture of compliance as well as just kind of verifying that compliance is indeed the case on some of these standards that, again, we know to be critical.
Yeah.
And I'll just add a little bit to that. I would say the biggest challenge from the 2018-2019 SOQ review was our data limitations. We didn't have exit survey data. We didn't have teacher effectiveness data. We didn't have race and ethnicity data to some extent. Vacancy data was pretty limited. We had Dr. Jen Hyvarena had to run proxies for us in a lot of these scenarios so that we could get some sense of what that might look like, because we knew what the research told us, but our data didn't necessarily easily fit into the methodology that we were using. But over the last couple of years, it has improved. That was actually one of the board's recommendations, was to improve some of our data collection. And while it's certainly not perfect, I think we're making a lot of progress to be able to use data more effectively in any of the new prescriptions or updates to prescriptions that we might do.
And the only thing I'll add, and some of it is a recitation of what they said, but you got a lot of information. Just by kind of boiling that down, divisions have historically self-reported whether they were compliant or not. What we're doing now, based on the JLARC study and General Assembly action that gave us 2 positions, I think, we're going to start doing verifications of their self-compliance. That had never been done before. And that's essentially what we're saying there. As part of that process, being that we only got 2 positions and verifying every SOQ would take a lot more resources, they asked us to estimate what it would cost to essentially do this full on. So we're going to take those 2 individuals as part of their year. We're going to put them and do an on-site verification of all the SOQs, map out how many hours it takes them to do a small division, how many hours it takes them to do a large division. Then we'll multiply that by all the divisions, and then that will be the number that we'll ask for in terms of resources. So we're going to be pretty far, even with the pilot, from being able to actually do what we need to do. The pilot is actually more of a study of how many more resources we need.
Helpful. Thank you.
Dr. Robertson.
My question is hardly as incisive as the others, more out of curiosity, but I also appreciate President Gecker, your context too. That was very helpful. The presentation was great. On the slides in which you showed the pricing of the initiatives in 19.
Yep, and Kevin, I might be off the PowerPoint, so we'll get it back for you. So.
Well, I don't think you'll need to.
Okay.
You showed 2 prices, and I'm assuming that one price was the estimated price and the second was the actual price.
First year and second year. So that reflects
Okay.
on a biennium budget and what it would cost in the first
See,
year and out year.
hardly incisive, just curious.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify because that's an important one.
Ms. Holden.
So, thinking forward, it's good we're starting this conversation now because we have to act on all of this by November or so, right? So perhaps, Mr. President, may I suggest that part of what we can do today is give the staff guidance on what we'd like to have them come back to us on between now and November on the ongoing ones. And I would put it into, perhaps if this is used, 3 categories. The first is, what do we want to reaffirm from our 2019 prescriptions that were reaffirmed in 2020. And that may be easy. We may just want to reaffirm them all. The one question I would have on that is, personally, I would suggest, should we think about making any adjustments on the three, as I count them, where the General Assembly has taken significant action, counselors, ELL, and the specialized student support. So I don't know what the answer on that is, but perhaps we should think about, should we make any adjustments on those three that they've already acted on? So that's one category, is do we want to reaffirm? Then the second category is in your slide 14, I believe, is where you've listed the things related to JLARC. And actually, I should probably add to that anything, recommendations coming from the JLARC reports, but also anything coming from General Assembly action that we really need to address. And I would love to see, I think it would be appropriate to ask staff to come up with some language for us around what, if anything, we should do about, should we add into this year's SOQ prescriptions around the school improvement program, for instance, or any of those other issues that came up in JLARC. And it may not be that we need to act on all of them. And special ed, for example, might be something that's so adequately addressed elsewhere, federal law, et cetera, may or may not be a top priority, but, ask for staff to give us guidance on things that you think we should be considering flowing out of the JLARC recommendations. And then the final category is what new do we want to put forward for consideration? And you've summarized some possibilities on slide 15. I would say on those two that the two bulleted from the African American Superintendent's Advisory Council, I think President Gecker mentioned these, that basically the two bulleted in blue, I put forward that we don't have any legal authority to address effectively. I mean, to the extent if the equitable distribution means between jurisdictions as opposed to within jurisdictions, I think we've gone as far as we can go on that first one in incentivizing equitable distribution, but I don't think we have the authority to require, and I definitely don't think, consistent with what President Gecker said, that we have any authority to reconfigure school division boundaries in a useful way. So I would say that we not focus on those two, but that there may be other things we do want to focus on in your revisit discussions language. So for instance, I think standards for facilities is something we may want to talk about. Now, it may be realistically that there's not a whole lot we could do between now and November of 21, but maybe we want to start something in motion for November of 23, or what? Or is there something of a general nature we could do in November of 21? But facility standards is absolutely a crucial issue that relates to our students' ability to learn in an important way, and that we didn't address before. We basically put it off. And so, should we discuss how to approach that? Of the others there, the other one that would interest me the most would be, I know we had some discussion about instructional technology resource teachers, but I don't remember it well. And, I'd love to hear a review from staff of where are we on technology instructors and resource teachers. I remember there were a couple of different categories there. Are we where we want to be, or is there anything we want to address there? And or what else? Does anybody here want to, but is now the right time for us to suggest things we'd like to have staff help us think through it?
Mr. Gecker, my two comments are actually kind of spot on with what Ms. Holton was talking about. I'd asked Mr. Gecker for an opportunity to make some recommendations for things you might consider. I'll start off by agreeing on the standards for facilities. I do think next month it's worth hearing a debate of whether that's SOA or SOQ, and not to confuse Keisha. We would not recommend that we do it like after we've done all this work, adding that in now, but maybe keep SOA going and bring that around kind of in 2.0, because there's a case that those standards could be SOA, not SOQ. And so we can probably debate that in the SOQ committee next month and then make a decision on that. The highest priority for me on that list is actually special education staff ratios. JLARC didn't address that really, and we kind of had hoped they would. They have not changed in decades now. And I would say that, that's a topic that's of interest to school divisions. And when we promulgated 2 years ago, we made a promise at that time, somewhat softly, but that we would come back and address that. And so I think, to Mr. Gecker's historical piece, I said this to him in our one-on-one meeting beforehand. I don't know that you need to do that by November of 21, as you were saying, but I think we need to kick off the SOQ committee's study of that for, if this is 2.0, for a 3.0 in SOQ. And so those would be the top two priorities from us. The ITRT thing, just to help clarify what I think that discussion was 2 years ago, there's a debate around, do we need ITRTs or just coaches? Because technology is now such a part of what all instruction is. Do they have to be focused on technology, or can it be a broader coach type? I'm not making a recommendation on that, but I think that's the debate that's at the heart of that.
Dan, it appears to me too that the Commission on School Modernization could provide some data which will help us in the discussion of standards for facilities. Dr. Lane made an outstanding presentation at the Commission's last meeting, chock full of data that also painted a picture for the Commission, I think, that was very compelling. And, our next meeting, right, or a subsequent meeting is intended to focus on what does the basic facility look like, right?
Yes.
Which is in part a way to say, I hope that, for the 2021 standard revision, I don't see us putting together anything around facilities at this point. There is a General Assembly Commission going on that Dr. Robertson, Dr. Lane, and I sit on, talking about building facility needs. And I think the issue is more complicated than we're going to accomplish in the next couple of months, honestly. And where it sits is also a question. I think you're right, James. But which is not to say I think it ought to go left undone. It is something, for years we've talked about, and I think we're finally at the point where we can take it on. But I don't think it's a couple of months. I think it's a year kind of project, not a couple of months kind of project. And, I will say I'm a little bit concerned that sort of the rush to do something will overwhelm, what I consider to be the need to do something smart. There's a lot of push right now to build with the amount of money that is purportedly going to flow in, and whether that ends up, what gets built, how it gets built, and whether those dollars are being spent the most wise way. I think may take a backseat to, gee, we just want something new and shiny for a little while.
So if I may just, then let's put down a marker, so to speak, to say that we think an SOQ addressing facilities is, or an SOQ, to addressing facilities either in SOQ or SOA is appropriate,
Yeah, I think
and we
that's
want
clear.
staff
I think that has been a
to
consistent
help us think
position.
that through, but we recognize that, that needs to go on the work plan over the next
Yeah, I think so.
18 to
Fortunately,
24 months
there
rather
really
than the next
are.
3 months.
There are very good guidelines for what ought to be in a new school out there on the website already.
And then I would suggest that we put also, that I do accept Dr. Lane's suggestion that we ask staff to help us think through special ed ratios. And I don't know whether that can or should, I think I heard you say you think that also not realistic to be done by November?
I think I think the board's going to want to study that. I think it's a 6-month project at least, if not a year.
But again, put down our marker to start it rather than to try to do it in this round. I'm comfortable either way on that.
And I think that any communication, whether it's through the SOQ or, you also have your annual report that you can kind of lay down some of these markers to the General Assembly about where the board is headed, where our focus is. And I think we have a couple of different options on how we kind of communicate that out to the public, the governor, and
Anybody else?
I'll just affirm, I like Ms. Holden's categorization, kind of 3 buckets that we look at. So that frame works, I think, very nicely. But I don't have anything more, Mr. Gecker, to add, to the conversation that we've just heard. So thank you.
Ms. Holton, just so I'm clear, in the areas where the General Assembly has done significant work, let's just say counselors, would it be the thought that we ought to conform the SOQs to the end product of that significant work, as opposed to continuing to advocate for a standard that might be a higher standard? And that's not a loaded question.
Right.
I mean, that's a
So
very
I would
serious
say
question.
my suggestion was that we have a discussion about that question,
Fair enough.
rather than, I'm not recommending an answer to that
Yes,
question.
I'm not recommending an answer yet either. I mean, in some sense, it would make sense to conform, honestly, in areas where we've seen significant work done by the Assembly. Dr. Wilson?
So just an observation, and it could be part of this ongoing conversation that we had. When we set the standard in 19, there was a reason for that. And so while the Assembly has made significant progress, and we certainly want to acknowledge that, I think it may raise the question, well, why all of a sudden? Or, is the need not the need, or is the
Well,
standard not, you know what I mean? So I think.
I will tell you
having that
why,
back and forth.
in my mind, on that. We made that recommendation really based upon, the industry group recommendation, and we as a board had been making that recommendation, not in the form of SOQs, but in the form of the recommendation for quite some time, right, the 1 to 250, and therefore it got incorporated into the SOQs. The only reason I think to change, because as you say, is the need, is, in my view of the world, as a result of the work between 18 and 19, if we had it all to do over again, we might prioritize some things slightly differently than other things as we learned what drives outcome. And so it may be we say, let's relieve the pressure, and I'm not suggesting this is the answer, but this is the hypothetical to get you there. It may say we tell the Assembly we want to relieve the pressure on additional funding in this area because the educational outcome increase will be X, and instead put it over to a different area, right? Effectively prioritized through doing this, where we believe that the educational outcome will be a larger benefit than it would be by moving marginally from 325 counselors to 250 or whatever that gap is. To essentially acknowledge, in a sense, that if we were to have prioritized, we might have gone a different direction first. That's the reason I would do it if I were going to do it. Instead of just saying everything, everything is as important as everything else at this point, given where they are, and frankly, given the supply of counselors in the Commonwealth. It may not be more important today to drive that last piece of the ratio down as it is to look at other pieces of the system.
That's fair.
Yes, ma'am?
And just by way of example, like the counselor ratio, as Dr. Wilson pointed out, that was based on a national standard. There's something concrete we had in mind, and the need. But the specialized support positions, the reason we recommended 4 rather than 3, I'm not sure it was as solidly grounded as the school's counselor ratio recommendation
Everything we
was.
did add was, evidence-based and clearly irrefutable.
Thank you for reminding me that.
Just so you know where we were.
But it may be that 3, that if our recommendation was a little bit on the vague, we knew we needed more.
And some of those were, they were
Dollars.
grounded in national standards, such as, the psychologist was like 1 to 500, or maybe 1 to 750, I can't remember which one, but instead of prescribing individual standards for each category, we decided to do 4 to 1,000 to allow flexibility for the school and the school division to figure out where their priorities need to be to support the students that they have.
That might be the one that I would be most likely to say, you know what, maybe we got close enough on The ELL, my personal suggestion would be we don't even have a conversation about it without Dr. Duran here since he's
Yeah,
our
of course.
expert.
I'll just make one comment. I would be a little wary about changing what you believe the need is. If it really is a discussion of priority, I think we can do that in the letter that we send them and say, hey, since you've done 3 instead of 4, since you've done 325 instead of 250, we recommend that you focus on other areas moving forward.
That's fair.
Yeah, I'm inclined to concur with that perspective. I mean, ideally, it's good for schools to have sufficient resources so that people are not overwhelmed in serving students. And you hear these numbers, especially coming out of COVID, and you think, do we have enough? Because, so anyhow, I appreciate that, Dr.
And on the EL, I know he's not here, so we're not going to discuss it at length, but the methodology, the money's there, but the methodology isn't necessarily. You had a very intentionally tiered focus. I don't think we walk away from that methodology so that even if it's 8 years down the road, understanding that the funding need is different based on your EL level is super important.
Okay, anybody else? If not, thank you, Dr. Sal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Superintendent Clark, and of course, Emily, for all your work here. I guess we are adjourned in the next committee at 2:55. Or I guess 2:30 we can do, right?
2:30.
Or 15 minutes. It's a 10-15 minute break.
Yeah.
I'm good with 2:30.
Committee meeting for today. I'm going to thank you for joining us today for the first time in person for our special committee to review the standards of accreditation. We're delighted to be here together, and we welcome those who are watching via YouTube. During today's committee meeting, we will receive a presentation from Ms. Shelley Loving-Ryder on growth assessments required by legislation from the 2021 General Assembly. This legislation calls for the administration of a fall and spring assessment in grades 3 through 8 in reading and mathematics to measure growth. And as expected, this could have an impact on accreditation, so it's timely for the committee to receive the following presentation, receive this presentation. Following Ms. Loving-Ryder's presentation, we will engage in a discussion on the recommendations received to date by the committee. It will be important for us to prioritize these recommendations and give staff direction on language changes needed, which we anticipate reviewing in July or August meeting. I will note that the staff has helped me color code using a little of my nerdiness and my engineering type A mindset to color code these recommendations based on feasibility to try to help facilitate the discussion. Before we move into the presentation and discussion, have committee members had a chance to review the minutes from our April 20th, 2021 committee meeting? Can I get a motion to approve or amend the minutes?
Dr. Paxton, I was not here for that meeting, and so I'm a little hesitant to. Thank you.
Okay, do I need to have a second?
I'll second it just in case.
Okay, second, thank you. Ms. Holton? We'll do a roll call vote for the committee members who are here. Dr. Davis-Vaught?
Aye.
Dr. Wilson?
Abstain.
Okay, and the chair votes aye. Before we start today's meeting or proceed with today's meeting, I do want to provide an opportunity for any public comment or remarks relative to this committee's work. Do we have any of those interested in our massive audience? All right. None taken, so we will proceed. So for the overview of the growth assessments required by the 2021 legislative action, I'm going to now turn it over to Mrs. Shelley Loving-Ryder, Assistant Superintendent for Assessment, Accountability, and ESEA programs to walk us through this presentation on growth assessments.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you in person and not to see the little squares around your faces. I am going to talk with you a bit this afternoon about some new growth assessments we are putting in place. If you all will let me know if I get off the slides, because I can't really see them and I may forget to advance them, that would be very helpful. All right, so to begin, we do have legislative action in the 2021 General Assembly, as Dr. Paxton noted, that requires the implementation of through-year growth assessments. And the real purpose of these assessments is to allow for a within-year measure of growth that we can use both to inform instructional decisions for students, but also to be used as a measure of growth in accountability. So the legislation is phased in 2021, 2022. So this coming year, it calls for 2 assessments in reading and mathematics for grades 3 through 8. 1 new fall assessment, so a fall growth assessment, and then we will have the regularly occurring SOL test in the spring, and we will have the potential of measuring growth from those 2 assessments. The legislation will be fully implemented in 2022, 2023, and we will have 3 assessments. 1 in the fall, 1 in the winter, and again, our usual spring assessment. So a phase-in with fall and spring this year, full implementation in the following year, adding a winter assessment. I know some of you like to actually see the code language, so I did include it for you. The text in red is the additional language that was added by this legislation. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about what we will do in 2021, 2022. It is already the 16th of June, and fall will be upon us very quickly. So we are working very diligently to ensure that we have something in place for this fall. So we want to make sure that these new growth through year assessments are aligned to our standards of learning. So we are creating shortened computer adaptive tests that will be based on standards of learning test items, and those will be used this fall. These assessments will be administered to students in late August or early September. We actually are opening the testing window on the 23rd of August. So students will be able to take the test beginning at that date. For this fall, the assessments will be based on the student's previous grade level content. So a student in the 4th grade in fall of 2021 will take an assessment based on grade 3 content. One of the reasons we're doing this is we know there's a great deal of concern about unfinished learning from 2020 to 2021. So the thought is that this will give us a good measure of potentially unfinished learning and will also give us an excellent baseline for the 2021-22 school year. And then, as I said before, in the spring of 22, we'll have the normally occurring SOL assessments that will be based on the current grade level content. So the grade 4 student would, of course, have grade 4 content. Okay, did I get off? I mean, this is the timeline. Okay, so again, this is the code language just for your reference. Basically, this says that we do have flexibility in 2021-22 to just do the fall and spring assessments, and noting that we will add a winter assessment the following year. It also notes the desire to have off-grade level items as soon as we are able. That is not something we will be able to implement in this coming year. So, of course, this also has an impact on how we measure growth. As you all know, we currently measure growth from spring to spring. So if we're looking again at our 4th grader, we will be looking back to see how that student performed on the 3rd grade content the previous year and measure growth based on that movement. The new legislation does require that the measurement of growth on these new individual student growth assessments be incorporated into accreditation. So one of the things we'll be bringing you tomorrow is a request for you all to allow the within year measure of growth as well as the spring to spring. Again, currently, we do look at that spring to spring. We now will be looking at a within year growth measure as well. So just as a reminder, we do use growth very heavily in the SOA. It's used in the academic achievement indicators, both in the overall achievement and also in GAP for mathematics and English. And the next slide gives us an example of what that looks like.
You went too far. Too far.
Too far. There we go. Thank you.
Hasn't caught up yet.
Okay. Let's see.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, I got it. Maybe I should just turn so I can see it a little better. Okay, so this is a graphic you all have seen many times. This is Jen Pavarona's explanation of growth. Just as a reminder, growth and accreditation counts the same as a passing score. So if we have a student who continues to fail the test but shows growth, that counts just the same as a student passing. So I think this is an aspect of the new accreditation system that school divisions really have appreciated. So if we look at growth after 2021, 2022, so when we look at growth for this year, we will be comparing the spring SOL scores, so the spring 22 SOL scores, to both the spring 21 SOL scores from the previous year if the student had a score, but we'll also be comparing to that student's score in the fall 2021. And then for this year only, we will pick whichever shows the greater growth. So it really is a pick best scenario where if a student has a spring grade 3, spring 21 grade 3 score, that could be compared to the spring 22 grade 4 score. We also would compare that student's spring 22 score to the fall 21. And whichever score shows the greatest growth, that is the one that we will use for accreditation. So, Jamel. Dr. Wilson.
So just to make sure I understand, the best ball scenario, right, is only for 21-22. And so after 21-22, will we choose, or will we say for certain it is a comparison between spring to spring or a comparison fall to spring? So, or is it either or? Sorry, I'm a bit confused.
So we haven't worked out the details
Okay.
of what we'll do for the following year.
Okay.
Because remember, in 22-23, we have the addition of the winter assessment.
That's right.
So then we'll be measuring growth from fall to winter to spring.
Yeah, so we're asking you only for next year. You will decide what you want to do in subsequent years, but we don't want you to make that decision at this time.
And so just to clarify, we'll come back to you with another recommendation. So what we're asking you to act on is just for this year and the pick best.
Thank you.
I do have a question on that. Just maybe my wheels are slowing down because it's cold, but I'm processing a little slower. So I understand the either or. I guess I'm trying to understand the logic or value between, and I also understand why maybe considering from the spring third grade year, capturing any gap or any lost opportunity for learning. But when it comes to that post comparison, why not only do fall 21 to spring? Why still considering the other?
I think there are a couple of reasons we are recommending the either or and pick best. There may be some students who don't have a spring 21 score. So then they would have the fall 21 as a backup. We were also seeing it as a benefit for school divisions. So if we do have a situation where a student had greater growth between spring 21 and spring 22, we would provide that credit. That might be a situation where a school division had a very strong summer program. And so if we were to look at the fall 21 to spring 22 comparison, the school division really wouldn't get the credit for that work they did over the summer. So it really is a situation we're asking you to approve that really is specific to this year because it is so unusual. Dr. Lane, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, I thought the two justifications that you mentioned for why we were considering fall and why we were considering spring were really good. I don't want to speak for the president because he's left. He and I have debated this issue at length, and I know one of his takes that you should know is if a student meets growth from fall to spring, but their results are worse than the spring previous, do we give credit for that? And so I want to interject that because I think he'll bring that up. So that's just something to think about that he has been debating is we would count the fall to spring as long as the result wasn't worse than the previous spring. So, other than that, I feel pretty confident with the methodology. I would not get into that because I do think that there are enough students that are not going to have scores in the spring that, you're basically giving a benefit to having not taken it if you treat it that way.
Is everyone okay if I go on?
Yes. Okay. And then, I'm sorry, just one more
Oh,
question.
I'm sorry.
This is, so the fall score is for the previous grade, which makes sense
Right.
because they're coming into a new grade in the fall. So you're going to go on content from the grade they just left. And so in some measure, you are going to have in the fall a measure of maybe what the year end would have been, whether or not they'd gone to summer school or participated in summer learning, because it's based on the prior grade. It's not based on a baseline of what the new grade represents. So in some ways,
I wouldn't say it's totally apples to apples, but Shelley and I had this conversation. It is measuring from the same standard, right?
Uh-huh.
So essentially, the end of third grade standard in May, the end of third grade standard in September, and then the length of the year. And that's one of the benefits about the pick-bet scenario that we liked, is it is measuring from essentially the same standard. Now, keep in mind, the fall diagnostic assessment's not an SOL, right? The fall test is not an SOL. And that's nomenclature we hope that you'll carry with us, because we don't want it to be confused with the SOL test. The fall diagnostic assessment, growth assessment, is much shorter. And so the spring assessment is the traditional assessment. So we did talk to our psychometricians at Pearson, even with the shorter assessment, could we stand behind the validity of the growth? And they said yes.
yeah, that's for me what I would wonder about. I mean, I can see the either or, given, I know they're not exactly identical, the same test, but ultimately I would hope there's an effort to ensure that the content represents enough of what you'd hope a student would retain that gives some validity to looking at fall 21 to spring 22 as a measure of growth.
And certainly we wanted to assess students on what they've learned, not on what they have not learned.
Correct.
Right.
Thank you.
So just following up on that topic, you all have been very creative in a difficult circumstance. I appreciate that. But I thought, Shelley, I understood that where we are now with computer adaptive tests, that students starting out that test in the fall of 21, you might start them out based on the content from the prior year, but if they're doing well, then you're going to, if you start them out testing them on the third grade content and they're doing well, then you're going to be asking them fourth grade content questions. Or if you start them out on fourth grade content and they're doing poorly, then you would drop back to third or go up to fifth.
And you are correct. That is one of the benefits of computer adaptive testing. It just wasn't something we could pull off by this fall. So that is the plan
The
moving
steady state,
forward.
this year being an odd year, but the steady state, the fall test, really, it's not like the fall test. We wouldn't want for a steady state to have the fall test, comparing the fall to spring growth, but the fall based on completely different content from the spring doesn't really make sense. So if it's all on a spectrum and a computer adaptive capacity to move between levels based on where the student is, then we're okay in the steady state after this transition year.
I think it's best to think of this year really as an unusual year where we're making some recommendations that are specific to the fact that this is an atypical year. And also, just to be honest, there are only so many changes we could implement given the short time frame. A testing program is a lot like an aircraft carrier. It's not easy to turn it. So, this is
Enough said.
And with that in mind, I know Shelley went into this a little bit, but understanding that 3 years from now, we will have computer adaptive assessments that will go off grade level, up and down. We're going to add items below third grade, beyond eighth grade, so you'll have more stretch and less ceiling and flooring effects, and all of that, which is more similar to some of the vendor-based assessments that school divisions are giving. And that's why we're not ready to make recommendations on the out years in terms of the methodology, because we want to make those recommendations to you as those assessments are built. And the legislation does give us 3 years to phase in each component. This year is just adding the fall. The second year, when we add the winter, we will go off grade level. The third year is when we'll build the stretch items. And so it's going to take us a good 3 years to get to all that. And then, of course, the vertical scale launching will also be a huge help because we'll be able to show where students are on a broader continuum than just a 600 scale per grade level.
I have a question, Shelley, and this is playing devil's advocate. Is there a way that a teacher could is there a way that a teacher could not place emphasis on the fall growth assessment in order to make it look better in the spring? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes.
Okay. Is that a possibility with this program?
And I think that is a concern that people often share about fall assessments. I mean, I think we would hope that teachers would understand the diagnostic value of the test. Now, and to be fair, it's not a very long test, so we'll get some information, but it won't be, it won't give specific information about where the student needs assistance. But, that is a concern. We have, I think, a strong relationship with school divisions, and I think we will certainly work to train to make sure that teachers understand that that's really not the best situation for their students.
And we're still working on what the security protocols will look like in the fall. And, everyone has to sign off on the security protocols in order to deliver our assessment. You're well aware of that. We very well may need to think about language that addresses what happens if you tell students to fail the test on purpose. I mean, it may actually have, that's an ethical issue in my mind.
I agree.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about methodology. So one of the benefits of assessing the previous grade levels content in the fall is that we can use our current methodology, which of course is looking at previous grade level score to current grade level score. And so we will be able to use that same methodology to measure growth this year. As Dr. Lane mentioned, we will be reporting on the vertical scale for growth. And there is an example of the vertical scale, just as a reminder for you all. This is the scale that goes across the tests. So you're familiar with the 0 to 600 scale for each test. This is the 2,000 to 8,000 scale that goes across the tests. So we will be able to report growth on this vertical scale, but we'll be able to use that old methodology that we've used for a while, looking at previous year content to current year content, just applying it to the vertical scale. And then, as we've talked about before, we'll come back to you for 22-23 to talk with you about how we'll measure growth once we are looking at the 3 assessments and looking at just within year growth. So what we'll be coming to you tomorrow is asking you to approve, whoops, I did not mean to do that. Okay, we'll be coming to you tomorrow to ask you to approve the use of current year growth, so within year growth, as well as the year-to-year growth as a measure of a growth for accreditation, and then to allow us to use the pick best methodology. And then, as I said before, we'll come back to you subsequently with recommendations about how we measure growth moving forward. Dr. Paxton, I thank you for your time. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any additional questions, Dr. Wilson?
Thank you. To what extent are divisions clear, aware, understand, or I'm sorry, I don't recall what we have shared to date with divisions about our work to move forward with legislation and our desire, frankly, to be able to measure growth, and this being a springboard to that.
So far, we have had 2 superintendents' email communications with divisions, telling them about the legislation, explaining to them what the assessments would look like in terms of shorter computer adaptive tests based on the previous grade level's content. We had a email that went out last week that provided a little more detail, let them know that the window would open on the 23rd of August, and giving them more detail about the length of the assessment. That was one of the questions we had gotten. So for reading, the number of items varies from 17 to 19, so it is a very short assessment. And for math, it's 20 to 25, so it is very short. That was something that school divisions had really wanted to know, how long is it going to be? And then beginning this next week, we'll begin to have webinars with the division directors of testing, finally known as the DDOTs, to talk more about how we implement this moving forward. So there have been a few communications. We've tried to keep school divisions up to date, in terms of what is happening.
Just think it's always important to remind us how we're communicating.
So if I'm trying to wrap my head around, I know future state is still under discussion, but if there's some intention to, whether it's, the fall, winter, spring, all be based on the same grade level content, then when you start to look at the continuum of it, are we not then at some point missing the opportunity to get that, even a similar look? Now, I know this is new, but because this first initial one is looking at previous years through the end of the fourth, that next year, that's a specific data set. It's not saying how much growth you made relative to the grade you're in at that point necessarily. See what I'm saying? It's not fourth grade to fourth grade. And then we move on, and then it's fifth grade to fifth grade, sixth grade to sixth. So are we missing is there any risk? Is there anything we're missing in making this type of transition, knowing we're limited, knowing the unique conditions of COVID and that, so we know there were learning gaps in that. So I'm just trying to think if there's any risks we're looking at as far as when we really try to look at the continuum in the aggregate.
And I think, again, because this past year was atypical,
Yeah.
Looking at something from the previous grade level does help us identify that unfinished learning. And it also allows us to use that old methodology of looking at previous grade level to current grade level. Now, in the out years, beginning in 22, 23, the test will be based on that grade level's content.
Yeah.
But as Dr. Lane noted, we will begin to adjust the algorithm to allow it to pull off grade level content if necessary. So again, we'll take our fourth grader, and that student in the fall might be really struggling with particular concepts in math. So the algorithm might drop down and pick up some
Okay.
third grade items. So
Okay.
I think we will get to the place where we're focusing more on the current grade level content so that you are getting that measure from fall to spring with the ability to reach up and reach down and perhaps up as appropriate for the student.
Okay, that helps. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Loving-Rider, for your presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I know this is very complex, so thank you all for your patience.
Absolutely, appreciate you. Okay, so we will continue now to have our discussion and prioritization on the recommendations received by the committee. As I noted in my opening comments, staff helped me to color code each of these recommendations based on feasibility. So in green, you will see recommendations that would be relatively easy changes or additions to regulatory languages. Highlighted in yellow are the recommendations that need additional information or a staff recommendation. And those in red are items that need additional data, time, stakeholder engagement before staff recommendation or language can be made. Generally speaking, most of the items highlighted in red would not be part of any changes to the SOA during this comprehensive revision process. So with that, before I open the floor up just to have a discussion and see kind of where the committee and board members are relative to the recommendations, I did ask Emily and some of the staff members to take some time with the yellow and the red items and just give us at a very high level some context of the why. Like, is it a data thing? Is it a time thing? Just so that might add some more to our discussion.
Thanks, Dr. Paxton. I'm going to walk through kind of the reasoning behind we color coded these the way that we did. And I have Dr. Lane and Holly and Michael here to kind of help me, phone a friend if I need to do that. So I'm not going to go through too many of the green ones, especially on the technical edits. On that side, I'll say, for the technical edits, we actually already have language ready to go, should the special committee want to move forward with that. So I'll just mainly go through those that are red and yellow and just give you a little bit more context to why we thought we should color code them in that manner. So first up, just kind of providing the summary of panel discussion recommendations. A lot of folks indicated in those panel discussions that they liked the idea of a new school climate indicator rather than chronic absenteeism. They also noted that chronic absenteeism has changed, including that as an indicator has changed some of their policies and practices. But really, our data is fairly limited in this area as it relates to a school climate indicator beyond chronic absenteeism right now. We do have the school climate and working conditions survey that has been administered, but it's not administered in every grade level. Most recently, it was administered in grades 4 and 5 and in grades 9 through 12. And then the working conditions was also administered to all of those that have a Virginia teaching or some kind of license from the state. So beyond, kind of what we have right now in chronic absenteeism, we don't have a lot of data as it relates to school climate to consider a new indicator in this area. So that was the reasoning behind why we indicated it red. As we continue to get additional data collections, that could change, but I think in the reality of where we are with this comprehensive review, we're just not quite ready yet because we do need that additional data time and stakeholder engagement on this one. Next up, I have that many of our panel speakers praised the use of growth in the accreditation model, but also encouraged us to consider how growth can be measured beyond standardized testing. I'll note that this item should probably be orange rather than red or yellow. With Shelley's presentation that we just heard on the addition of new through-year growth assessments, adding any additional measures would be a particularly heavy lift. So I think, this one, like I said, maybe should be coded orange rather than yellow or red because we do have some additional indicator or growth that's going to be factored in this coming year. All of the panelists encourage additional flexibility with graduation requirements and verified credits. We have certainly provided a lot of flexibility with COVID, and I think that we could look at that a little bit closer, but don't have a specific staff recommendation at this time. But if that is something that the committee would like to explore and for us to put together a staff recommendation, we could certainly do that. I'll note that we have provided a fairly extensive amount of flexibility on the verified credit side over the last couple of years, and especially obviously in these last 2 years with COVID. And then certainly if any of my colleagues have things to add, feel free to do that. The last one kind of under this header emphasized the need for equity in the accreditation system. We have kind of further down in here where we do plan to add some equity considerations into the SOA compliance side. And so I think that we are doing that, but certainly that needs to be a continued focus for us through other comprehensive reviews to the SOA. And I will skip all the technical edits and kind of move down to the recommendations from the African American Superintendent's Advisory Council.
They provided a lot of great recommendations to this committee and to the full board to consider on a variety of topics. The first one being to include a discipline disproportionality as an indicator in the state's accountability system. And you all received a presentation from Dr. Pivarena and some of our colleagues in student services around this topic. And I think that there is a lot of interest in adding this kind of indicator. But as you'll remember from that presentation, we are getting ready to start a new data collection on student discipline. And so I think we need some time to collect that data for a couple of years. One option could be, if the committee's interested in it, we could start reporting that data on the school quality profile for a couple of years. And then in the next comprehensive review, consider that data to be potentially an indicator in accountability. And I would say the same, and I might phone a friend on a couple of these, to create an opportunity and access indicator, which would require schools and divisions to report enrollment in advanced coursework and details on course offerings. I think we, again, just need a little bit more time on this one in order to think through some of the feasibility behind it. An opportunity and access indicator, when we've been thinking about adding any indicators, we've had those principles in mind that we need to have valid and reliable data. And I think while we can get there, we're just not quite ready for that thus far. And kind of same, a lot of these kind of go together. Sure.
Pause for just
Absolutely.
Do I recall that maybe in years past, I believe there was a question on the gifted annual report, perhaps, that asked about enrollment in advanced level courses. Am I remembering that somewhere?
I think so.
There's probably,
I believe, I seem to recall,
We had a gifted ed presentation.
right, so,
I don't remember.
We're all.
okay, so I certainly.
I think it's probably in the master schedule collection, so we would have to disaggregate it. I don't know that there's a special report on that.
Correct.
Yeah.
One of the challenges currently, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine.
But, is we're currently in the process of putting the master schedule collection, data collection process, especially with the SCED codes, moving to national codes so that we can have better transparency on what kids, the content the kids are taking. And one of the real challenges is that for years, school divisions were using locally decided codes. So it was just a local code for, it was a catch-all. And so we've asked them to move to very specific codes now. So there's a transition process to make sure that our data is really clean. And it'll take them, well, for next school year, they've been told to use those, and we've deactivated some of the codes, but there will be some transition time to make sure that the codes that they are using are appropriate and accurate.
So, so I appreciate that, Mr. Rowland. My observation was that, and I certainly understand that not having the data or a structure even yet to collect the data is something that is aspirational. But I guess if, and I'm likely wrong, but if there's already a mechanism in place that gets toward the intent that ASAC is intending here, perhaps there's a way to begin understanding access and opportunity for students of color in courses that are at whatever the level is. But I'm just suggesting that adding an indicator may not be possible, but is there a way to get to surfacing information that would be useful to informing local divisions, processes, and whatnot?
And I think a lot of these recommendations that we have highlighted yellow or red, I think we've highlighted them in this manner because we're not ready for them to be an indicator into accreditation. But I think that this committee could certainly recommend items to start being included on the school quality profile so that that information is starting to be uncovered in the public. And that traditionally has kind of been a little bit of a ground zero to where some of these data points behind indicators start is on what used to be the school report cards, now the school quality profile. And so by no means is the color coding meant to say we're putting it on a shelf and never touching it. It's just to say that we're not ready for it to be an indicator in accreditation right now. And I think a lot of what Michael just told us about master schedule collection speaks to a number of the recommendations from ASAC. Again, very worthy recommendations and ones that we are working towards and need to consider, but just not quite ready yet for that prime time to be, for schools to be held accountable through accreditation. Two here that I have highlighted in green to require an equity advisory committee at the division level and to require school boards to adopt equity plans or the establishment of some kind of equity goals. Both of those could be added into your SOA compliance area and would be a relatively easy change to our SOA language. And then kind of the last header I have here, just topics and questions that need additional information or need a staff recommendation. I will note that we did, I didn't color code a lot of those because I wanted those to be topics for discussion for the committee. But we did go ahead and color code the considering the consolidation of diploma options. Obviously, received a significant amount of public comment on this topic. And a thought exercise for the committee to consider. We do know that there needs to be a lot more stakeholder engagement before we are to even in this area. And so I did go ahead and certainly would love to get the committee's feedback on all of these bullets here. To give us some additional direction on kind of where you'd like to go, because ideally we can start bringing some language to you all in July or in August to bring recommendations to the full board this fall. And so, Dr. Pexton, I'll turn it over to you unless anyone else has things to add. And we're also here to answer questions as you all continue your discussion.
And I might just add on Timothy's last piece. I think the department has no interest in this time as on a single diploma option. So we would not recommend moving forward on that.
Okay, so thank you for that additional context, Emily, for all the recommendations. So what I was going to recommend, just to move the discussion forward, was really looking at the green recommendations first, kind of the low-lying fruit, the things we can kind of address and move on from. There are 54 technical edits that are listed there. So I'll start with just the technical edits only, absent from the other green recommendations. Is there any discussion, additional questions, clarification, or concern that the committee has, or any board members with accepting those as they are? Or would the committee and or board require more time, considering you did just get these recommendations? I mean, you had all weekend, but.
What have you been doing with your time?
Please. So as a non-committee member, but thank you for the opportunity to engage. First of all, thank you for the color coding. Very helpful. One green item that I just wanted to ask about, which was, and I'm having a hard time finding it now, but there was something about clarifying the requirements for the work-based learning alternatives around civic engagement, I think it was. I'd be here.
Change the column to civic readiness index.
It's not the index one. No, that's not the one. but there was one that was going to clarify what counts towards work-based learning options, I thought. And I just wanted more clarification on what you had in mind. We're not too careful. If we're not careful, that thing gets watered down to the point of being non-existent.
I changed the bullets to numbers, so I know which number it is, but it's about the 11th bullet down from the beginning of the technical aids, I believe. Update language related to citizenship skills to reflect a variety of work-based learning experiences.
Yes, that's the one. Thank you. Update language, yes, we're pursuing. So, yes, I just would love to hear more about what you have in mind on that with the concern that we don't want to water it down beyond our intent.
And pull up our.
We don't actually have the language, you haven't given us that technical language.
We did walk through that in the March 17th.
Okay.
So if you actually, and I can add this to your board vote, we do have, actually, you can probably pull it up.
Yes, I can go back to the March 17th. I'll go back to the March 17 and look and see if I have any wording concerns. I will share it back with you, Madam Chairwoman.
Okay. That being said, again, relative to the technical edits, I do want to respect the time that the committee has to review these. If there's any reservation, with the exception of the one that Ms. Holton, we pulled that one out, is there any reservation with the others, accepting them as is, or taking some more time to make that decision?
Dr. Pexton, I have one clarification for the team if I can ask about it. There is one that makes a technical edit to amend Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts to just Scouts. There's actually, my understanding is that Boy Scouts are trying to change their name to Scouts because they just allow girls. And the phrase Scouts may not include Girl Scouts in the legal sense. That's probably worth looking at. I think that's actually in court. So you might want to just leave them separate.
And Ms. Holton, going back to your question about work-based learning experiences, our current language states internships and externships. And so our recommended language is to change that to work-based learning experience. So it would include the search learning.
And then are we defining work-based learning experiences somewhere else maybe? Is it in you all have got some guidelines that you're working on that are in process?
We have an updated work-based learning guide that comes forward sometimes.
So the SOA would refer to work-based learning more broadly, and then that term is spelled out in with further clarity.
It's like 160
Yeah.
page document.
Okay.
You'll probably remember the comprehensive.
I'm comfortable with that
approach.
approach. I'm comfortable with that. Yeah.
It's just saying that internships and externships become a subset of
Right.
work-based.
Madam Chairwoman, with my clarification, I withdraw any concern.
I had changed that to light blue, the new colors, I will turn that back.
That's the 11th bullet you were just clarifying, that's about internships. And so, no, I know, but why does the title reference citizenship skills in Ms. Holton's question?
I just thought about it.
Yeah, I would just more accurately reflect for the public that I don't think it really is about citizenship skills. I think it's about internships. Right, yeah. So I would just say that.
So just one observation, Dr. Sexton. So as we think about our comfort with the recommendations that are here, I am comfortable. I'm a red line kind of person, and I kind of need to see all of the language rather than bouncing back and forth. So certainly with the recommendations that are all in green, seeing what that actually looks like compared to what's currently in the document would be very helpful to me. So on its surface, I don't have any things that are, that I'm flagging at this moment, but certainly once I see it all, there may be something that doesn't quite fit for me. So that's the only, I appreciate Ms. Holton's observation about CT and work-based learning and all of that. We don't want to water down the work day. Jim would not be pleased with that.
So to that point, would it be appropriate then to consider asking for that information to be compiled in a way that we could do that? And then we could use this time, okay, so that we could use the time between now and maybe the next meeting to walk more comfortable with that information. And this is specifically related to this.
Yeah, and we have the technical edit red line ready. We can also, once we get some additional clarity on some of the other edits, we can try to incorporate those into kind of a full document that I'm incorporating substantive and technical edits.
So that's kind of how we'll frame the rest of this conversation, is really making sure we're clear what we'd like to see in a final document for our review based on the recommendations that we would even want to consider.
I'm remembering another question within the green, under the recommendations from the African American Superintendent Advisory Council. There is both a green flag requiring equity advisory committee at the division level and a required each school board to adopt an equity plan that includes the establishment of equity goals. Are those considered alternatives? I guess we could do either or both, but maybe that's worthy of some discussion by the panel of whether we want to do both. I guess maybe the committee serves a slightly different purpose from having a plan and a goal.
And I think to Ms. Holton's observation, I think depending on the locality, they may see an advisory committee versus a set of goals, the equity plan, and one feeding the other or not. So I do think asking that question, is it an either or both and? That's a good observation. Yeah, thank you.
Personally, I would like the plan with the goals is the most important one.
Yeah.
Some might do that through maybe an advisory committee is also useful, but.
Right.
Yes. I just think it's so specific to locality. I'd love it.
So would we be interested in some language being proposed relative to those two bullets for us to consider how that might look?
Also, I know that this recommendation has come, and I'm not answering your question, I acknowledge that up front.
Okay.
I know that this recommendation is coming from the ASAC, but of course this applies. I wonder if we've had any input from from all divisions, or as many of the, Dr. Lane, with your advisory committee, your SLAC, we don't call it SLAC anymore, but you understand.
Leadership Council.
Yeah, and whether or not any of these recommendations, particularly that would go to things like setting up the advisory committees and whatnot, if that's been vetted at all, or what's the plan for getting input from the public generally.
I think that's the broader question, is how do we want to get feedback? We have certainly, SSLC still meets. But we have gone to more of a whole state solution during COVID and been talking with almost every superintendent on a regular basis. And we have certainly at numerous times throughout that process made them aware of this SOA work and to provide feedback. But I think unless we directly engage, that they're not thinking at this level of granularity. So we'll take your advice on that, but certainly Emily and I can come up with a plan for engagement on that. I think once we get to final draft status, I think we can use those couple months to really dig in too.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just a point of note, not that it's sufficient feedback, but that was the other green recommendation from the panel that we had, that they all emphasized the need to focus on equity. That doesn't give us any specifics on how or what specifically to go do, right? That's just a notional nod, but let's take a connection there. So what I think I heard there is that we can plan or expect to maybe get some additional feedback on after you've done on how you might do some stakeholder engagement on the housing mechanism.
Yeah.
Okay.
And with not just superintendents, but I think the SBA, we're going to their executive committee in July, I think. So we can do some of that work then. Well, you're doing VACO on the day, but.
Well, and I would just, and now I'm realizing, most of the green items are characterized as technical edits, and I think that's an accurate characterization. walk so that, 3 years from now, you hear, oh, no, we can't do a question, no. Is that something that is the right place to do ultimately?
Yeah, I agree. I do think that these are sort of equations. So this is consolidate our survey research with numbers specifically defined survey. And probably an SOA 2.0, which more like that could happen. I think we ought to look at that further. I just don't believe there's going to be any interest in an additional tool to collect that. And we can talk about other indicators we might want to put into that, but that's the tool that would be the basis for whatever you do.
What's the timeline?
We were required to consolidate those under legislation, by the way, which is why I believe even the General Assembly would not want there to be another survey created.
So-
Right now, we don't have any indicator based on any.
Right, so, yeah, that's what I'm saying, is I think our next step is to take that survey and decide how we might measure it to a rating, if that's your goal. Yep. And you know, I completely agree with Pam that we don't change our federal indicator. If we do anything, I agree that it should be additional and keep the chronic absenteeism ratings.
So what's the timeline of where either the development, implementation, data gathering of that survey?
Well, in the context of what Ms. Holden said around not doing anything big right now.
Right.
I would finish up what we're doing, and then I would almost immediately go into I think you could do it in about 2 or 3 months of what's actually in that survey, how can you consolidate it into a single rating, bring in some superintendents to talk about their thinking on that. So I think that's something we could start pretty quickly after we wrap up what I'm going to call 1.0. Because I do think the tool, I really do believe the tool is,
All right. Just making some notes when we recap and be on it. All right, any other discussion on that potential recommendation? Basically, sounds, what I've gathered is that we're going to take advantage of the tool that we have available for us today. We'll put a plan in place to how can we use that information, the tool, use it to the information to get in front of the right stakeholders, get some feedback, and see what that data is telling us, what that feedback is telling us about what a potential indicator could be relative to school climate. All right, so we had 3 other red-coded recommendations under the advisory council's section. I counted them as 3, could be like 3.5, the way that it's color-coded. First one, dealing with the discipline disproportionality, and it was noted that we did receive a presentation earlier from Dr. Pivarena, and DOE is getting ready to start the data collection process, and that data could be indicated during our next comprehensive review. If there's an agreement with that, then we would leave that recommendation as is and not see any need to take any action now during this review. Concurrence on that. And then the second bullet, so Emily, I guess we've got 2 sub-bullets under create an opportunity and access indicator. One was yellow, one was red. I don't know if we talked about this, include a measure of access to academic rigor and accreditation, which could be a composite indicator. Did I miss that one? I didn't make any notes on that one as to the why. the context.
I think that one we were talking about in context to the master schedule collection.
Oh, that was that. Okay, I put it
There,
on.
there were several in relation to the master schedule collection, why we aren't quite ready for that yet.
Gotcha. I had that noted as the wrong one. Okay, so any concern or feedback with the reality of that recommendation? The including a measure of access to academic rigor. Again, I'm just looking for low-lying fruit to.
Well, again, I would agree. I think this one would be a valuable one potentially for the next round.
Mhm.
And maybe one way to think about it, and this kind of gets you into the yellow, what do we need to do in the meanwhile to be able to set ourselves up to potentially add an indicator in a later phase? And, you know, the discipline proportionality, we're already in the process of gaining more data on it. But on this opportunity and access indicator, if there were, maybe what, in a long-winded way, trying to say, what about, let's do the yellow, require schools and divisions to report more so that we might have something to build on into an indicator at some point. And is that what we're doing already? Or is that something we need to ask?
Do we have it?
I think we're going to begin collecting more information on schedules. So I think what you're suggesting is important so that you can learn from it. I think that's-
So what we'd love to have is not just schedules, but schedules and compare them to demographics and stuff.
Right, yes.
So we already collect.
We're getting ready to collect more.
Oh, we are already.
So
Okay.
let's some of that. So just to make sure I'm clear, so we are collecting some form of data, but we are going to define the level of data that's occurring.
We want to start consolidating that in the reports where you can start to look at these all.
And we'll make sure that it's, we need, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, we're going to verify whether or not it's in the SOA that requires collecting it, that which might be something that would be a recommendation.
All right, so to summarize what I heard relative really to that, I'm going to say that full bullet as far as creating an opportunity and access indicator. Relative to the first sub-bulleted yellow, the recommendation is to allow some time for that data to be refined and then eventually consolidated into a report for the board to be able to review and better understand what opportunities might exist in creating relative to that recommendation. And then the same thing, was it the same thing for the measures of success? We should consider that at the next review, but based on what this report information is telling us, it might help inform that discussion better. Is that correct?
I think that's fair.
All right, and then the last read under the advisory council's recommendations was to establish a single indicator or composite score related to school climate. I guess that ties back up to what we additionally said before. So I think we've addressed that one, unless I missed something.
And I know Ms. Holton brought this up, but the next two bullets were green. Did I hear that you want more stakeholder engagement on that? So that might be more yellow? Is that right?
I have that they wanted to see some red line language on that, but that we also needed to include stakeholder
Yeah.
engagement on this topic in between this meeting and our next meeting.
I do think our school boards and superintendents will want to weigh in on that at this point.
I agree that it's probably more yellow than it is green. It's less of a movie right. Like,
Yeah, let's go get more information.
yeah, I'm gonna make that note, Emily, to change those to yellow just for, keep us clear. So with that leaves just 4 recommendations. Since we're already in the African Americans Superintendent's Advisory Council section, one of the yellow recommendations we already addressed up top about requiring the schools to report on student enrollment. The other one that was yellow was the very last one, which also relates to the master schedules. So I'm assuming that probably connects back then to the point we're making about the data collection and refining it. And am I missing something there? the very last recommendation?
No, I think that's right.
You're correct.
Yes,
Yeah.
right, okay.
Once we get the new master schedule collection, I think we'll be able to talk more about that.
Okay, so the last two recommendations that we haven't spoken to specifically is back up under the panel discussions. So, well, in some case, we have, the recommendation around growth in the accreditation model and the discussion that we just had today. And ultimately, this recommendation was about adding additional methods, and Emily pointed out how this should probably be more orange than yellow. And so that being said, considering what we have on the table today and tomorrow, is there any opposition or concern about, I guess, allowing this one to mature? We need to allow some time to allow this one to mature a little. All right. And then the last one, I'll encourage additional flexibility with graduation requirements, and Emily acknowledged that the department has been quite flexible as a result of COVID, and that they would be willing to provide a staff recommendation if it was of our interest for them to do so. Thoughts or feedback on that?
The only one I have, and I apologize, I've read this so many times, I don't know that if I've missed it in the technical amendments, but I feel like I'm speaking for Francisco here. He really wanted to make sure we came out with something solid on the EL piece in terms of SLIFE students, now that we have a definition. Is there a flexibility in the way that we would count those students in the GCI or?
That's in the last.
Yeah.
Bullet or last header on page 5, where I have some topics and
Yeah,
questions.
I was gonna go
that we need
there.
to consider.
As a final piece.
Because I know, Dr. Lane, that you had some specific ideas around how to potentially include that new SLIFE definition into accreditation, whether it's through dropout, GCI, or some other way.
And that's what I'm saying, is that, I know we haven't really honed in on that, but that's the one yellow piece that I think might be green. I think that, I heard pretty loud and clear from Francisco, he wanted to make a decision there.
That's how does the new SLIFE definition fit with accreditation?
Yeah.
Is that the piece?
And so we should probably discuss that next month with him here, but my guess is that he's going to want to recommend something such that someone that falls within that definition, may not count against the school in the dropout rate. Not so much GCI, I think. I think GCI kind of covers it. Shelley, don't you think so? I think it's more the dropout rate.
Okay, and so did I miss something in how that connects back to the additional flexibility within graduation requirements?
Well, I think that he considers that flexibility in the way that they're
Gotcha.
calculated
Okay.
in graduation and dropout rates.
Okay, all right.
And I think that as I sit here and think about it, I think it's more a dropout rate. I'm pretty sure on that, because GCI gives you credit for staying enrolled and some other things. And so I feel pretty good about the flexibility in the GCI.
Are there other topics similar to EL students relative to flexibility and graduation requirements that we need to be considering as part of this, or we might want to consider as part of this recommendation and/or get additional input on?
When Emily referenced her remarks on this, she referenced, I wondered if this was specific to the conditions we're operating in around COVID versus something that might be more fundamentally tied to structure for graduation requirements. I couldn't recall. I remembered that conversation about seat time and hours, but then I can remember if it's related to this or not, because there was a lot of conversation about, well, not a lot, but there was one panel that I recall spoke very directly around the need to evaluate things with respect to.
Yeah, what the panel was talking about is you've provided through COVID flexibility to count local performance assessments and other types of assessments in lieu of history and writing, the non-federally mandated assessments. And that's gone really well. And of course, there's budget language, which will govern this after COVID, that, essentially says that the more permanent solution around these assessments have to be state-created tasks and rubrics. And that's why I think it's yellow more than green, because we still need a little bit more time on their tasks and rubrics. Is that fair, Shelley?
But we will be coming before the board with that information.
Yeah, so, but I think we might do that outside of the SOA, right?
In July.
Guidelines.
Right, so I think that's why it's shaded the way it is.
Okay, so again, any other specific topics relative to this recommendation that we want to call out? Okay. So I was going to wrap up by just addressing that last section of topics, questions that need a staff recommendation. We've made a note there. I've made a note for the second bullet that will really wait till next month to discuss that one a little bit further, get some good input from Dr. Duran. We've got 3 other items there. Well, actually, and one is kind of relative to what we were just talking about, any accreditation changes needed due to COVID that maybe not specific to graduation requirements, just generally
That was
speaking.
something that Ms. Holton, in reviewing kind of notes and everything from the last year or so, Ms. Holton has brought up a couple of times, just you were questioning, is there anything that we would need to change because of COVID as we have the SLA open? Not suggesting that there needs to be.
Right, yeah. Yeah, what I was thinking is kind of, I guess, maybe to ask that question differently based on all the, we've been flexible, we've done some things, but hindsight now being 2020, a year and some change into this, is there anything that has become maybe more codified in what we're doing that should be considered, whether or not it meets the level of breaching the standard of accreditation is what I would ask.
The things that jump out to me are really related to virtual, and we're going to NORA that separately. So I would say nothing stands out to me that's not already going to be addressed through other ways.
Okay.
Or guidance. Right.
Okay.
And there's one piece in budget language around K-3 class size reduction that's been under discussion.
But I
But that's not, that would be outside of the
Okay.
SOA.
All right. I'm jumping down now to student discipline and disproportionality. Aren't ready to be added to the accreditation model yet, but how do they fit into the committee's recommendation? Should this new data collection be added to the school quality profile for a few years? And I made a note, because I think that the other came up earlier, about things that might be recommended to be captured on a school quality profile, this possibly being one of them.
Yeah, because I think, even though this is an SOA committee, still putting recommendations forward to the full board for items to be added to the school quality profile, which certainly within your scope of work.
So any feedback or input from the committee or the board relative to that specific topic?
I like the recommendation of adding it to the school profile. Mhm.
So as we think about where things ultimately land, thinking about what we hope our outcome will be. So, there's this tension, I think, between, I have information that reveals or illustrates where schools and divisions are with regard to discipline and disproportionality, which we've collected for a long time, right? But what do I do with it? So where does information force action? right? That's the tension that we're coming up against, and I think the school quality profile as a beginning point makes good sense. I worry that it becomes just information with no action forced or no, it's inert. Not working. But you understand what I mean, what we want to see is change, and so what is the right mechanism? I think that's where the tension is. Is it a tool to say, here it is, or is it a mechanism to actually move to improvement? And that's where maybe we can take some time, and I think have it on the profile initially, maybe, or as a first step makes really good sense, and then we can give some time to think about what's the next step beyond that.
Yeah, as an example, I think transparency around it is a lot, because I think it's a good first step as well. Because we do collect this data and we do report it in an aggregate, but we don't really break it down by school, which this will be really interesting. But I think of it like remember back in the day, everyone thought that 65% of expenditures.
We're dating ourselves, because we can now say back in the day.
I feel like I've worked 100 years in the last 6 months.
I bet you did.
But remember, we used to have worry about whether 65% of the expenditures were instructional, and then there was some requirements around that later. Everyone was already there by the time the requirement came in place. I think this is similar to that, where it's, let's set out let's report it first. And I think your second phase is set out an expectation that doesn't lead to an accreditation deficit. And then once people have moved or not moved, then you build accountability around it. But I think school communities are going to hold themselves accountable when this starts coming out much more transparently in a quality profile. Back in the day.
I refuse to use that term. I'm still with it.
So what I've captured is that there seems to be concurrence around the fact that there's value in using the school quality profile as a starting point to capture information. But we agree that that's not it. That's not all. That possibly this type of transparency would help to be a resource to inform a later accreditation review.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Could have been a court reporter. That was the first thing I wanted to do. Now I think about it. All right, the last one is again relevant to the discussion today. I kind of feel like we answered part of that question today. Do the new through assessments have an impact on growth calculations and accreditation model, and what decision points need to be made by the special committee and board? I think we have one of those decision points tomorrow as a board. My perspective is I feel like as that process matures, those decision points are going to be brought to us, and we'll have more information about the impact of those growth calculations. And so I don't know that there's more that we need right now relative to that conversation, but I'll open it up to you guys if you think otherwise. Okay, well, we just went through 65 recommendations, so we got something done today. See how good we are when we get in person? I'm not even as cold anymore. I actually got some work done. No, so appreciate the committee and the board members and Dr. Lane and the department's input and support, and really just trying to synthesize everything that we've learned and all the information we've gathered, the people we've heard from, into some sort of starting point of the so what, what do we do with it? So just to kind of summarize, and then we'll wrap up. From the technical edit standpoint, we're going to get a red line review of current state versus what would be proposed. We, as far as the other green recommendations, a couple of those greens turned yellow, where we feel like from the equity standpoint, we've got some more opportunity there to get some more stakeholder input to help maybe give some more fidelity to what those recommendations could look like. And so, and that really addresses the remaining portions of all the greens, very strong connection there, and even runs over into some of the yellows. For a lot of the red edits, there was a lot of consensus that more data, more time. We did want I'll say a commitment to a plan as far as next steps relative to the, one second. Lost my place. Oh, the school climate survey. And really next steps for that in the short term as far as getting some good feedback from the tool that's out there now, seeing what it's telling us. That's really going to help inform a lot of the other red line or red colored recommendations that we had. And then the last thing that I noted was relative to some of the other remaining yellow recommendations that we had. A couple of them very much relate to where we are, current state, in the new regulations around the growth requirements. And so we're going to let that play out. And then as far as recommendations related to COVID impacted related recommendations, most of the topics that would be of consideration are likely going to be handled through other mediums or platforms. So does that sound? So what we'll expect to receive is kind of like I said, a copy of the technical edits. We'll use these next few weeks. Once we get that, we'll use this time between now and the next time we meet to absorb that. And we'll use the time at our next committee meeting to really get some concurrence or any more clarity we need on those as far as that's concerned. Any questions, recommendations, any recommendations that anybody that you do not see on here that, which I'm surprised that I didn't capture all these. I'm not taking credit for this. I really thank Emily for helping me pull this all together. All right.
I will say that I think I know that we want to wait to have a discussion with Dr. Duran on the slide.
That was the other one.
Definition, but I also think we as staff can kind of convene and talk through some possible scenarios. So potentially we can bring a couple options to the committee, and we can also talk to Dr. Duran in the interim to get his feedback on it. Dr. Lynn and I talked to him about it in a one-on-one meeting. We can talk to them and follow up with him there too.
Yeah. But before we wrap up, so from a timeline standpoint and where we are as a committee and relative to the things that we have on the table today, and you and I talked about possibly being in a position to really kind of wrap this up by the end of the summer. We still feel comfortable with that based on the discussion today?
I think so. I think we can actually provide the red line document for all the technical edits in short order for you all. I won't send it tonight, so you don't have to read it tonight, but I'll probably send it to you all next week so that you have plenty of time to digest, potentially get us questions so that we can address those. At the July meeting, we can walk through that document with you, see if you have any questions there. And I think potentially a July meeting and certainly August if we need to, but I think we could probably wrap this up with some kind of recommendations in July to bring to the board in September. And, we want to do the first and second reviews in September, October. But I think we can still probably need that timeline.
Okay. Okay, well, I thank you again for everybody's input and for the department's support in this committee's work. And as we've been saying all day, it's been good to see everybody in 3D. And so I will conclude the meeting for the committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
done.